everyone. My name is Becky Franta. Thank you for coming to my Econ 3 broadcast presentation. Today I'll be presenting on the duration of homelessness in the United States. Before I get started, I just want to go over a quick background or a quick overview of how my presentation will run. So I'll start with a background and literature review going over some of the key findings in this field, followed by my theoretical framework and empirical approach, which I'll go in depth explaining. Then I'll talk about my data and empirical analysis, followed by a brief glance at the marginal effects of my empirical model, and then conclude a discussion. So getting right into it, my research question is, what is the role of demographic and behavioral characteristics in the duration of homelessness? Or what demographics and behaviors lead to a longer homeless spell? And this is a really important question to ask, I think, because according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, homelessness has been an issue since the early 1980s after the 1981-82 recession. And since then, all levels of government have been trying to combat this issue. However, it's still estimated that nearly or over 500,000 individuals are homeless on any given night. And I think that's a pretty big number and something that we should be concerned about. And so it kind of makes you wonder, is this, what causes homelessness? Is this a housing availability issue, or is it a public assistance allocation inefficiency where we aren't targeting the correct population? And so this has been a question that's been debated in policy and in research. And yeah, they ask the same question: is this because of housing? Is there not enough subsidized housing? Or are we not targeting the correct group? So Troutman, Jackson, and Eklund took the housing side on this debate and wanted to assess how well federal grants for subsidized housing addressed, or how well they were in addressing and reducing homelessness. So they studied 40 cities in the HUD survey of 1984. And what they found is that spending on at least the pre-2000 housing programs was not that effective in keeping people out of homelessness. So it might temporarily, however, the longer term spells, these type of programs are not helping them very much. However, programs that funded or supported rehab and like mental health issues were much more effective in removing people from those longer term spells. And so they determined that it's not necessarily allocation of housing on a national level. Maybe it's more localized, where cities aren't providing enough subsidized housing for their given homeless population. However, sometimes these programs can create incentives for people to declare homelessness just so they can get those benefits, whereas they might not if they don't declare that they're homeless. On the flip side, Culhane and Kuhn, as well as Allgood and Warren, looked at the demographics and characteristics of homeless populations. And so Culhane and Kuhn were a micro-level study. They focused on the homeless population in New York City and Philadelphia, while Allgood and Warren did a macro-level study where they studied the homeless population across the United States, which is what I'll be looking at. Both of them concluded that being older and being male typically lead to a higher probability of having a longer homeless spell, as well as having some sort of mental health history leads to a longer homeless spell. So I think that's kind of interesting when you think about the types of groups that you need to target in order to end those long-term homeless spells. So with that in mind, I work that into my theoretical framework, and so those three research papers that I just referenced all use utility theories to explain how someone becomes homeless and remains homeless, and focus on the role of income. And as I believe that income is very important in poverty and homelessness, I think that there's a missing factor in that. So something that I do a little bit differently than most of the literature is that I look at sense capabilities theory and think about the role of real opportunity and how that can limit someone's ability to get out of homelessness and remain housed. So if, for example, if someone has a physical disability where they can't work, not only are they only limited by their bodily ability, but they also are limited by the amount of income they can earn. So with that capabilities theory in mind, I created this flow chart that you see in figure 1, and I started out assuming that the individual is housed, and then one of three things happens. So here you see that they will lose their house literally because it's they lose it due to a natural disaster or was condemned. They had to relocate for some reason, so they don't have a house and they have to find somewhere else to go. Or on the other side, you see here they lost their income, and so they were hurt on the job and can't work, or they lost their job completely, and so they don't have that income coming in and they can't afford the residence that they're staying in. Or in this middle section, these are the non-market factors that can cause someone to lose their house. So if you have an addiction problem, a mental health issue, you suffer a domestic violence relationship, or some kind of family arrangement issue, can all lead to homelessness. And occasionally these factors can lead to loss of jobs. So for example, if you have an addiction problem, you can lose your job. And so not only do you have that non-market factor issue, you also don't have an income anymore. So after one of those three things happens, then you either become homeless immediately, or it's more likely that you'll turn to your social capital at least right away. And your social capital includes your family, friends, or outreach programs. And so when you turn to your social capital, then you're housed at least temporarily. However, there gets to be a point where you can exhaust that social capital, so you say you're welcome on your friend's couch and they kick you out, or the outreach program only allows you to stay in some emergency shelter for 30 days or so, and your time is up. So you no longer have temporary housing, you are now homeless. And then this part here shows that this can be cyclical, and that you can be homeless and then resolve your issues and become housed again. However, this may happen any number of times in any different number of ways. So to test this theory, I used an ordered logistic regression. And so this is a little different than an OWASP regression. It's more of a probability test. And so an ordered logit model is an ordinal regression that has ordinal or categorical dependent variables. And so what that means is that my dependent variable is not continuous, and so as you see in table 1, my dependent variable has 9 categories, 0 through 8, and they all represent some duration of a homeless spell. So 0, as you can see, stands for 0 days, or they've never been homeless. 1 means they've been homeless for less than 1 week, 2 1 week to less than 1 month, and 3 1 month to 3 months, all the way down to 8, which means that they've been homeless for 5 years or more. In table 2, you'll see all of my independent variables that I'll be testing, and you'll notice that there are quite a few of them. That's because they're all dummy variables, and given the data set, that is the best way to measure this. And additionally, you'll see all of the predicted signs here, and I want to point out that in this case, a negative sign is a good thing, while a positive sign is not such a good thing. So for the log of income here, which is my only non-dummy variable, the negative sign means that the observation is less likely to be in one of these higher categories, or are less likely to have a longer homeless spell duration. And then if you look at gender with a positive sign, this is a dummy variable. 1 means the observation is male, and 0 means female. So positive would mean that if you're male, you have a higher likelihood of being in one of those higher categories or having a longer homeless spell than you would if you're female. And so just some other variables that I have in here are different age groups, different races, education, location, and then marital status. And as you'll see here, married is the only negative sign. So going back to the theory, if you have that social capital available, you're less likely to have a longer homeless spell, whereas if you're divorced or separated, you might not. And then, as you see in all of these variables that represent mental health histories, you have a higher likelihood of having a longer homeless spell. My data comes from the National Survey of Homeless Assistance Providers and Clients, which was a survey done by the U.S. Census Bureau in 1996, so it's a bit of an older data set. And so what they did is collected data across the United States on different demographics of homeless populations from various homeless assistance providers. As you'll see in table 3 and 4, I have a number of summary statistics labeled here. At the bottom of table 3, you'll see how my the categories of all different types of homelessness in this data set. So you'll see that 2,567 of these observations are currently homeless, at least at the time. 369 were previously homeless, and 514 were never homeless, for a total of 3,550 observations. Here, I don't have all of my variables listed just because there's so many, so you'll see in the min and the max that it's 0 and 1, meaning that all of these are dummy variables. And then I also want to direct you to the mean, which, because these are values of 0 and 1, the mean is actually a percentage of the population that fits that specified variable. So for gender, what the 6.63 means is that 63% of the observations are male, 41% are white, 41% are black, and then 71% live in a central city. So yeah, these are just observations that I thought were most meaningful, that hold the highest amount of the observations given that type of group. So here are my results for the Logit test. If you look in the upper right here, you'll see the probability greater than chi-squared of a value of 0. This chi-squared test is very similar to an F test, so it means that my variables have some explanatory power, and that you wouldn't be able to get this likelihood ratio of 438 without at least some of these variables. And then the pseudo R squared here is not very big. However, this shows again that some of my variables have explanatory power. So before I get talking about the results here, I want to point out that the coefficient, the only thing I'm concerned about here is the sign, the value of the coefficient. It doesn't really matter, the magnitude isn't important because this is a probability test, so you can't test the magnitude with these coefficient values. So if we look at the log of income, we have a negative sign and a significant test. So this means that if you have more income, you're less likely to have that longer homeless spell. Same with gender, positive sign and significant at the 5% level. So if you're male, you are more likely to have a longer homeless spell than you would if you are female. And then some more interesting statistics here are divorce and everything below that, incarceration histories, abuse and neglected histories, and drug addiction histories, are all positive signs and significant at least at the 5% level, some at the 1% level. And so what this tells me is that if you're divorced or if you have been incarcerated before, you're more likely to have a longer spell than if you were not divorced or hadn't been incarcerated before. Some other interesting statistics that I thought were a bit surprising were the age. So you see the third and fourth variables here. I only have 2 of the age variables listed. However, all of them were statistically significant at the 1% level and all were positive. I was a little surprised by that. I wasn't expecting to see at least how significant they were. Maybe that was some kind of error in the regression. Additionally, you'll see that white, black, and Hispanic races are also all positive, however not statistically significant. This may be because the only thing that they're based against is other race, which includes the mainly Asian population, and they have a pretty small homeless population, so that may be some variation there. And lastly, I want to look at the married variable, which has the correct sign, a negative sign. So if you're married, you'll have more likely to have a shorter homeless spell. However, this observation was not positive or not statistically significant. So just to take this one step further, I looked at the marginal effects of this test. I only have a few of the variables here as well, but as you'll see here in this one, the marginal effect of marital status. So what this means is that if you're married or widowed, you have between like a 3 and 7% higher likelihood of being in that 0 group or not homeless group than you would if you weren't married or you weren't a widow. And on the flip side, if you're divorced or separated, you have about a 3 and 5% chance less likelihood of being in that 0 group or not homeless. And then if you look at the other extreme, it's pretty much like a mirror image in this graph here in figure 4, where if you're divorced or separated, you have a higher likelihood of being homeless for more than 5 years, whereas if you're married and widowed, you have a less likelihood of being homeless for 5 or more years than if you weren't married or widowed, which goes back to the theory again, how I stated about having that social capital available. Then if you look in figure 5 and 6, they kind of show similar charts here. Figure 5 is about mental health histories. So same thing, if you if you have a mental health, alcohol, drug, or drug and alcohol addiction, you are less likely to be in the 0 group or have a shorter homeless spell than you would if you do, as you see down here now, at number 8, you're more likely to have one of those and have a longer homeless spell. And then the same goes for being a veteran, or having an incarceration history, or being abused and neglected when you were a minor. So I think that those are pretty telling results. So overall, my results, I had like significant predictors, and that you can see there are things that lead to homelessness and longer homeless spells. However, there's a lot of uniformity across these predictors. So as you saw on this last slide, it's not, one of these is more telling than a different one. So I think that homelessness is pretty situational, and it's hard to target one population when everybody's situation is different. So as far as policy implications go, I think that there's results that say what's going to cause a longer homeless spell, and maybe targeting those people with those characteristics more than those that we know are going to have that shorter term homeless spell would be a better allocation of those resources. I did run into a few limitations with this project. One is that most of the literature uses a hazard model or a survival model to test this and to understand how long someone will truly be homeless. So if I were able to perform that, I would, if I had more time. Secondly, this data set is from 1996, so it's a bit old. I would have liked to have a more recent data set to see how the demographics have changed since then. And that's all I have, so thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
So going back to the theoretical framework you had, kind of that cyclical cycle you're talking about, and then when you're discussing policies, do you think that there's a direct way in order to combat this effectively? Because I know you said that each case of homelessness like varies so much, but do you think there's like, not a general solution, but at least something that we could do as a society to at least help this cycle not be so vicious?
Right, I think the cyclicalness comes from these non-market factors. So if someone has an addiction, that's really hard to kick, and that's when someone is more likely to have that longer homeless spell. So instead of just providing some kind of assistance through SNAP or TANF, if the government funds some kind of rehab program or some kind of supportive program, that would really help people get out of homelessness permanently versus like, okay, they're gonna get funded for their house for a little while at least. However, there's certain restrictions, right, for SNAP and TANF, that if you're a user or something, you can't use those programs, and so I think that's where that becomes cyclical.
Okay.
How much effect do you think we would have on social capital if we tried, rather than influencing the homeless person directly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think as far as the family and friends, that's more of an individual issue, I guess, but outreach programs, maybe if these outreach programs provide more than just like food, like a soup kitchen, if they provide more than just food and had more like job training type things or more learning. I know there's programs like that, but maybe putting more funds into programs that give people skills versus just providing them a cash benefit would be more helpful.
Any others? Another one, go.
Yeah, sorry. So do you think it'd be effective, instead of maybe targeting the cyclical process, maybe go and combat the like personal issues they have, whether that's in-home abuse or drug addiction? Do you think that'd be a more effective way to combat like homelessness in the long run? Or do you think those are kind of like they just will happen regardless?
I think that they would help in the long run. I think that there's a lot of preventive care for like domestic violence situations. And so I think those help and get at least women and families back on their feet pretty quickly. However, for addiction and mental health issues, I think there could be more to be done to combat that. And then those family arrangements, that's more like if a mother has 3 kids and she's working 3 jobs and her kids, she can't afford daycare, so she has to quit her jobs in order to take care of her kids. So maybe that's where the TANF comes in and those kind of cash benefits.
Cool.
Well, thank you.